Alright, we're going to talk about using frequency content to get a good full mix. This concept is very easy to understand, and you probably already understand it, the basic concept that it is. Using it well can sometimes be a problem. So it can be problematic if you let it become problematic, and you get confused by it or you're not sure, and some real simple things to help you with. First of all, it can be different on different mixes, so get that in your head. That's a huge concept that I learned anytime trying to fill out frequency content, that I might do something on one mix and it sounds really cool, and I try to do that same thing on some other mix and it just doesn't sound quite right. It's lost some of the vibe, or it's lost something, or it's added something to it. It's got nice sound and full, but it just took away something that was really, giving it vibe. That's really hard to describe. I'm talking about, I've got Eddie Van Halen's guitar, but it sounds kind of, I really could brighten it. I could really fill it in and really make it sound full, but all of a sudden, now it doesn't sound like Eddie Van Halen. And I've lost some of that vibe happening from some song he's done, and it's like everybody got some, and all of a sudden the guitar sounds a lot fuller, but, and it doesn't sound quite right. Does that make sense? So that can be a huge concept to deal with, and something you just kind of have to work through, and it can be different on different mixes, so don't get frustrated about that. That can just take time, and it can also be a matter of your preference. Billy, Bob, and Jimmy might mix it differently and do different things with it because of the way they think it should sound, and you might do it differently, and that's because that's the way you think it'll sound. That's a huge concept to get through your head, especially when you're working on this, because all music is frequency content. So as you start working with that, it's going to be your interpretation, unless you got Bob sitting there with you all day anyway. So eventually you're going to have to figure out how you want it to sound, and it sounds correct to you. That's the way you think it's correct. So so I'm not trying to make that too simple, but a lot of times, when you will get to some point that you're going to go, no, that's the way I like it. I don't like the way Bob does it, and I don't care if you think Bob's a genius, and it's like, and you might say something I do, and you go, oh, well, the guy doesn't sound like an idiot, but I don't like that, and that's not the way I want to do that. Or I might do it a little bit differently because that's the way I think it should sound for the stuff I'm working on. Peace of love, bro. You'll eventually get there anyway. Just like there's how many different styles of guitar players, different tones, different ways they play. That's the same kind of concept. So, the biggest concept when we're talking about getting a good frequency content, you've got a piano here. Look at all the ranges you have here, okay? Now, to try to fill in as much of those ranges you can, you're talking about, here you're looking at about 28 hertz up to 39 hertz. And, the hearing, you're going to get up to around 20,000 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz and down to maybe 20 hertz, or above that, depending on your age, Does that make sense? So in trying to fill in that frequency content, so the biggest thing to understand about that, the first concept you want to understand is on some productions, you can really fill in the whole frequency range, the audible hearing range, and it'll sound good. Some productions, it starts doing something to production where it just doesn't sound right, like it's just too full. Now all of a sudden my rock song is starting to sound like some kind of damn symphony. That's not the vibe that I want, bro. Does that make sense? And that can be true. And a real quick way around that, so that you can use a lot of frequency content, is to bring that frequency content down. Like, let's say you've got this production, and halfway between the second, octave level on the piano and up to somewhere around after the fifth octave level and up to a little bit of sixth, that it sounds good, but that's about the octave range that you're dealing with. Does that make sense? And if you want to fill up above that or down below it, you're going to use, sub bass, or you're going to use some really high content that's very clean from a piano that's following the chord structure, that's brought up really lightly underneath it to where you really can't hear it, but it starts to fill out the sound. If you take it out of there, you'll notice it gone, but does that make sense? That means if you can start to notice it, back off some, and you might have to back off a little bit more. every little bit can help. But that's a huge thing to get through your head, and in using that, if you look over here at some of the instruments and some of their ranges, when you're talking about the range, here's an accordion, right? Just for an example, there's its range, right? There's its frequencies and there's its range. Well, it fills in a whole big, huge range, doesn't it? Well, the problem is, when you start mixing those together, that the issue is you're trying to fill in as much frequency content as you can. And after you start to mix it, you're going to use high and low pass filters to try and fit it into the mix. That means in one mix, in this accordion, after I get it in with the rest of the mix and start listening to it, then I might be able to bring that high pass filter into it and cut a whole lot of this upper end off, and it sounds really good in the mix. In this other production, it might not. And in some other production, I might even be able to cut out more of it with a low pass filter, and it sounds great. And the reverse of that being true also for, a high pass filter coming in and cutting out some of the low content. Same thing. That's part of that give it its own space concept, which is really hard to deal with when you first record that you trying to get it sound as good as it can by itself. But when you start mixing it with the rest of the production, then what are you going to have to do to it? You might do some low pass and high pass filtering on it, and you might start doing some notch filtering and things like that, boosting some frequencies, notching some frequencies, so that it sounds good in the mix. Does that make sense? So those are really huge concepts to get together, to get into your head, so that when you've got this accordion and you're going, oh, it doesn't sound too bad, you start doing a little bit of low pass filter on it, you start doing a little bit of high pass filtering on it, and you're listening to it, that sounds pretty good. So then you get out your another EQ and you start trying to notch a little bit here and boost a little bit here, and well, that's starting to sound really good. You've cut down a little bit right here, and you've actually boosted this up a little bit right in here, and wow, that accordion sounds cool. All right, I'm really happy with that. I like that. All right, that sounds good. All right, I'm done. All right, now you pull that into your mix, and all of a sudden you're listening to it, and you're going, well, it didn't really sound that good with the mix now. So that you go back and you go, well, maybe I not boost that up a little bit like I had that there. Bring it down. How does that sound in the mix? Do that. You start to rework it again from listening to it with silence all around it to listening to it when it's got other frequency content mixed in with it. Does that make sense? So you basically might end up mixing it twice. I always mix it twice myself, almost always. I want a good sound of it, and I want it done. And then when I start mixing it with other stuff, I'm going to redo it to that mix. And I might even EQ it differently in different sections of the song, depending on what frequency content is behind it. And that can get very complicated, but to do a good production, sometimes it can be very complicated. You're supposed to be an audio engineer, signal processor, that's what you do. It can be very complicated, very, it's not, all being a rock star. Does that make sense? So, that's a very important concept to get through your head. The other concept, here's another key concept. I've got this accordion playing here, right? And it doesn't sound really full. And when I got it with the rest of the production, it sounds kind of not full and could use some help. And, the progression of the accordion falling, some of the other instruments are falling. So I go find some instrument in one of my synths, or one of my samplers that's really super clean, like a sub bass line or something. And I'll use the upper end content to follow the chord progression of that accordion and start boosting it, make a recording of it following those chord progressions, but super clean. No distortion, no effects on it, no nothing. Just really clean, figuring out what kind of waveforms to use on it to make it sound really smooth, really clean, so it's not really adding a whole lot of vibe to it, just frequency content, the clean frequencies. Does that make sense? And I'll play those chords behind it, and I'll start boosting, way up here in the upper end and way down here in the sub bass, and start bringing those up underneath it in the mix. And all of a sudden it starts adding this body. It's like all of a sudden the mix has this impact and this presence. Does that make sense? That takes experimentation, but that can be huge. I mean huge. And so that concept's real important to get into your head. using that, or another instrument. Another concept is you might go, okay, well, this instrument it's a main instrument and it's playing around C4, this octave range for the most part, and that sounds good. So it's got this other, I want to add some other instrument up in here in the 6th octave range and down here in the 2nd octave range, you know, something that's complementary to whatever instruments are playing there, and then follow that chord progression, and then slowly bring that up, you know, slowly bring it up under the mix, you know, to where, I mean, you might not even be able to hear it real good, but you can feel it start to add body to the mix, fill out that frequency content to get a good full mix. And one serious concept to get through your head about that is you're doing that. String instruments are great because they're really, it's like a sawtooth wave, and it's very smooth, you know, and it's, you know, and if you do a little bit of EQ on it, it can be a very smooth kind of sound. That might not be appropriate. You might find some other instrument and combinations of instruments. You might mix some kind of cello with some kind of French horn, you know, that comes out with them mixed in a certain way. It's got a really cool tonal quality. Then you've mixed those together and you're trying to bring it up in the upper end to try to add body in the upper end, but not very much. I mean, they might not come up any more than this, or down here in this frequency range compared to the rest of the frequency content and its decibel level that this accordion plays at, but you're pushing up in there to try to add body. And with the different combinations, the instruments are choosing different instruments, it's going to add different textures to the mix. So not only are you adding body, but you're changing the texture a little bit. Does that make sense? Those concepts can be very complicated, but that's a very simple way to look at it when you're doing it. And also behind this, you know, well, I don't want to get into that too much because that's sound sculpting, but, you know, so I'm going to steer clear of that. We're trying to fill in frequency content. Best thing to normally do is use really clean stuff. Clean sinusoids or chord progressions, something as clean as possible in the lower or upper frequency, or away. It's around here in the 4th octave range, so you start trying to fill in the 5th and the 6th and the 7th, the 3rd, 2nd, 1st. You've got just an accordion, and you start filling in the same chord progression in these other octave areas best you can with some clean, and starting to bring them up. You'll be experimenting around with that. All of a sudden, you got this huge sound, and all you did is add this other frequency content up underneath it. That's a huge concept. So, and the other concept was, that concept we could talk about for the next 12 hours. But that's a very simple way to look at it to get you experimenting, because there's lots of ways to do it, and it can sound different in different productions. There'll be one reggae song, and if I start doing too much of that to it, it's like, all of a sudden it's like, you know, I don't sound like this raw reggae thing anymore, dude. You know what I'm saying? But a little bit adds this body to it. And you have to be real careful that as you're doing that, you don't add a lot of mud. If you start pushing that frequency content that you're trying to use to build the frequency content of the mix up too much, all of a sudden it may start sounding muddy. Does that make sense? It's like you'll get somebody else say, well, I'm trying to cut all this low end out of the bass end because it's making my mix muddy. Well, you know, the best bet to do is you want to cut out some of that lower end, because it's probably muddy crap down in there that, you know, isn't clean. And you can bring some other low end frequency content that's clean from a synth, that's clean wavetable synthesis, up underneath it real lightly, that's going to give that body in the low end, that's not going to give it that muddyist. Don't be throwing reverb on there and all that other stuff. You're not trying to mess with that right now. You're just trying to build frequency content. Don't worry about all that. You can worry about that later in the mix. Then you can, you know, that is a whole nother issue. And that's very simple. And we already talked about, here's the accordion, here's the vocals, here's the drum. They've got different frequency content. Look at this drum hit. I mean, this kick drum hit, you look at it, you look at the frequency content way down here, how it drops down here, all of a sudden it boosts back up here again. on that specific kick drum. On all kinds of different kick drums, it can be different. And I've seen a lot. And then when you start getting into, electronic drums and, hybrid drums, I mean, all of a sudden you're looking at content and you're going, what the hell is that? And you're trying to figure out how to sculpt that in the mix. Well, the best thing to do, like I've said, is each instrument to try to sculpt them to they sound good by themselves, to where you're really happy. You've done high pass filtering, low pass filtering, you've done some notch work, you've boosted a little bit, subtracted a little bit here, done some work, starting with the equal loudness contour of where you should be boosting and where you should be subtracting from is a huge concept to understand. Go look at the video on this channel about using the equal loudness contour and as a place to start from of where you should start boosting and subtracting, because that's the way your ear hears it, those decibel levels. Does that make sense? Once you get done with that and you got the mix going together, then you start trying to shape this content. Well, now I've got this mix going, and the bass drum, it's making it sound a little bit muddy or something. So the first concept you have to get in your head that you might have to do a little bit of high cut filtering on it to try to cut out some of the higher end it's mixing in with the bass a little bit. So you're trying to isolate that bass, that kick drum away from the bass a little bit. So you're doing some high cut filtering on it, trying to give the bass some space. Well, the thing is you kind of want to mix them together. That means if you can, you want to be able to put both those tracks on together and have two EQs out there to where when you're, does that make sense? And sometimes I'll have that going with 3 or 4 or 5 different instruments, trying to EQ them at the same time. Well, if I cut a little bit of that high end out of that bass drum and and then I let that, I start cutting low cutting off that bass drum a little bit. Now they're starting to sound. How's that sound? How does that sound with the rest of the mix? All right, I'll let that come up a little bit on the bass drum a little bit, and I'll let that drop down a little bit with the bass drum, the low cut filtering off of the bass drum. Or the bass guitar. I'll let that come down. And I know that sounds funny, but you'll be just kind of going back and forth with those two, trying to figure out how to give them their own space to where whatever frequency content from this drum and whatever lower end frequency content from the bass guitar are intermixing, that they're not causing mud from mixing together and overpowering each other. Because you've got this frequency content right in here from this bass drum, and you got frequency content from the bass guitar here. Well, those frequency content, here's the mud, is those, let's say that level is here, and the bass guitar level is like around in here somewhere, all right? From at this frequency level, at this frequency, correct? Well, when you multiply this and that bass drum set that's right here, now you got this, correct? So now the bass drum is louder, or the bass guitar is louder than the bass drum. Well, you don't want that, do you? So you start trying to reduce the volume of the bass drum instead of doing what you should do, which means you need to be trying to figure out how to cut that frequency down a little bit in that bass drum to not be muddying the bass guitar. Does that make sense? That can take a lot of time, and it's something you just gotta have to work with and experiment with. And that's the thing they talk about, giving that instrument their own space, and be careful of multiples like we're talking about. That whole concept, understanding the bass guitar is right there in volume level, and or right here. And it's like, that's pretty cool with the bass drum, that's fine. But the bass drum's creating this harmonic content here that's going to boost this level up how high? Up in there somewhere? So now it's louder. So now you're trying to turn the bass down, but the tonal qualities, you're subtracting some of the cool tonal qualities instead of coming in here and trying to notch that bass drum a little bit so that it's not muddying the bass guitar. That concept can be very hard because it sounds as simple as just, well, I'll just notch that there and then it's good to go. Well, then the bass guitar is playing up in here. Well, then it's down here. Oh, does that make sense? So at best, most of the time, you're trying to low pass filter or high pass filter, and maybe doing a little bit of notch EQ work. And then when you start mixing them together, you might notice that, that the bass drum's interfering with the bass guitar a little bit in its frequency range, and you go on there and you go, well, I need to notch it a little bit or boost the bass guitar a little bit or something in that frequency range to try to help it a little bit so it's not getting muddy. And does that make sense? And you really kind of got to work with it when you get in there. And that is something that's just going to take experimentation on your part. And I'm sure I'll do some more videos later, and there's spectral content shaping on this channel that would be very helpful as far as that is concerned. So I think that, you know, that is kind of what we're talking about, filling in that frequency content. Also, another thing to use that's very huge is harmonies. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, some Alabama song where all of a sudden, duh, you got this cool harmony. Sometimes harmonies with the same instrument or another instrument that are down very low, that are adding frequency content to something to add just a little bit. Harmonies can be really cool to use that way, that aren't just a full-blown harmony, or a harmony but at a lower level to where it's almost not noticeable, but it's adding this vibe to it that also adds frequency content to the mix. That is a huge experimentation that basically when you get the mix done, if you can add some harmonies to it that are down really low, that aren't really noticeable, and you'd be like, well, what's going on there at that change? It almost sounds like there's this harmony behind it, but you can't really hear it. But it sure adds this texture to the sound. This sounds really cool, but it's not really, doesn't sound like a full-blown harmony. Like you can really hear harmony going on, but there's like this other harmonic content in the upper end or lower end that sounds really cool, that added this cool texture. That's another thing to really experiment with. So understand that. So, you know, basically when you're trying to fill in the frequency content, that's what you're trying to do, and those are some ways to really help you. There's lots of ways to do that. There's lots of different instruments to use. I'm using all kinds of different instruments to fill in other frequency content, because let's say I'm trying to fill in the high-end frequencies up here, okay? And on this mix, I'm going, okay, well, on this mix, using the piano on it and, you know, really messing with the attack on it, making it really slow, making the attack not really sharp so it's not harsh, you know, and using a chord up in there sounds really good. It's adding some frequency, and I put a bunch of sustain on it, and it sounds really good filling in that really high upper frequency content on that one. You know, on that mix, it sounded so cool. I filled in the frequency content. Wow, it sounds great. Well, on the next mix, I'm messing around, and that doesn't sound good. So I figure out the piccolo and the way that it sounds. You know, I try to deaden the attack a little bit so it's not so sharp, and, you know, the attack on it not really hard, and try to get sustain on it so when I'm following the chord progression. And that piccolo sounds really good filling that frequency content on that mix. Or the violin might. Or you might find one of these other instruments on a synth pushed way up there, you know, in the upper ranges, that it sounds really cool filling in the upper frequency at a very low decibel level, you know, up underneath the rest of the mix to try to fill in the lower and the high end frequency content of the basically centralized, you know, content of the mix. Does that make sense? So those are huge concepts to get through your head. So I hope that helped a lot. We'll get into that more. The one last thing is that the whole idea of giving an instrument its own space is very difficult concept. It just is, because here's a vocal, right? Now, I went through and I've done some low pass and high pass filtering on it, and I've done a little bit of notch work on it, boost and cut on this vocal, you know, after it was recorded, and it sounds pretty good. Now when I get it in the mix, I'm not messing with those EQs. I might even render it like that or bounce it with those EQs on it because I was really happy with it. And it does sound good. Now in the mix, what do I have to do with it in the mix? All of a sudden I got that, all of a sudden I want to do some high cut on it. And all of a sudden it sounds really good in the mix. Because of the other frequency content I have in there, that vocal sounds really good like that because I've done a little bit of high cut filtering, or I've done some low cut filtering on it, or I've done a little bit of notch work here, you know, a little subtractive EQ or a little bit of boost over here. You know, I've attenuated and boosted a little bit in a couple of areas. Now it sounds really good in the mix. That can really be part of giving the instrument its own space, which can a lot of times just take a lot of work. You know, if you're really particular and you're real anal about it, that you really want it to sound as good as it possibly can. Does that make sense? And, giving it its own space as far as that is concerned, once you understand that, you can spend a lot of time jumping around between different instruments going, okay, well, I'm doing a little bit of high cut filtering on that bass, and I kind of want, and then I'm listening, I'm doing a little bit of high cut on the vocals, I'm doing a little bit of high cut on the bass drum, I'm doing a little bit of low cut on the bass, I'm doing a little bit of high cut on the snare, and I'm doing a little bit of low cut on, that hi-hat, and then on and then, on this section, there's these crash cymbals. I'm doing a little bit of high cut, a little bit of low cut. How's that sound in the mix for that one? All right, I'll cut it a little bit more. That sounds pretty good, and that kind of thing going on. That is basically works out to giving the instrument their space during the mix. Does that make sense? So that it's not like some algorithm. It's like, all right, cut 20% off this, 10%, 2% off that. That's the dang algorithm, bro. Well, it doesn't work that way, because you're in the middle of this jazz song, and all of a sudden you come to this section, and it's like, whoop, I'm going to have to cut the whole mix apart here, because in this section of this song, all of a sudden I got French horns, I've got some... What the hell is that instrument again, Bob? I don't know. What's something from East Africa? It sounds cool, bro. Let's have fun. And it's like all of a sudden you start having to EQ things a little bit different from that set for that part of the mix. And so you cutting the mix right down the line for that section and EQing everything differently so that it meshes well and the harmonies mesh well and everything that's going in. Maybe not a lot, sometimes not very drastic, sometimes very drastic. And, that's a huge thing to get through your head. That you'll be going along, and all of a sudden, you've got this harmony thing happening at this section. Everything else stops, and there's just the guitar and these two vocalists. And all of a sudden, well, you're going to have to figure out that section of the song is basically its own private mix that you're going to have to work with, and mixing those into individual sections, mixing those individual instruments for that section. Does that make sense? So you might have to use insert effects, EQing it just for that section and things like that. That can be very difficult. Or using automation to where the whole EQ work that you've done for the frequency content is automated and changes completely for that section. And that's a lot of work, but that's your job if you're going to be an audio engineer and, doing a good job, because you are trying to become, a mixing engineer. Does that make sense? Which is arguable whether or not that's a full-blown audio engineer, but we won't get into that right now. So those are some huge concepts to get through your head, so that when you're trying to fill in your frequency content, that those are the issues that you're dealing with. And you're talking about the frequency content. If you can come up with other ways to fill in that frequency content, that please do. Experiment around. Get out your, a keyboard or an instrument, an accordion patch, play some chords, or play a guitar with some simple chords on it, and start, it's between the 4th and 5th range here. So you want to try to fill in the 6th and 7th, up as high as you can and down as all this lower frequency content with the same, chord progression, with a really clean synth, wavetable synthesis, and bring it up real lightly underneath it to where even just with that guitar, that it sounds so full behind it. And it's not like, oh, I can hear synthesizer back there. No, I can hear this really cool low end following the progression, and I can hear this really high end following the progression that's adding this body to it. Experiment with that, because that's going to be the basic concept when you're working with a mix anyway. You'll be doing that same concept but with a full mix, trying to fill in the frequency realm so it sounds as full as possible. And the only concept that you have to worry about there for the most part is whether or not you use very clean sounds to fill in the content, or sounds that have character, have color, because that's going to change the sound of the mix. So you have to take that into consideration. And the other thing to keep in mind, that almost always it will work at some decibel level. Here's this reggae song. I just filled in every damn octave on the keyboard and in the human hearing range with other frequency content from a wavetable synthesis playing the chord progression. And in this reggae song, at this level, behind the whole rest of the mix, it sounds great. It just adds this body to it. Does that make sense? You can't hardly even hear it, and it's not really changing the whole vibe of it, but it's adding this body, and it doesn't sound muddy. I haven't put any effects on it or anything like that. And, you got this other song, you got this heavy rock song, and you've cranked it up to like in here. And with that heavy rock song, it sounds awesome, dude. It has sounded this body to it. I brought it up just enough to where it's not muddy, but it just added this huge spectral content to it. There's like a wall of sound, bro, and it sounds badass. And you got this not light jazz, but a little bit heavier jazz song, and you've done the same thing, but you can only boost it up to this level, somewhere in between those two, and it sounded cool and full. You could hear it a little bit, but not enough to make you go, there's like other frequency content there, but it's not real noticeable. But all I hear is it sounds full. Does that make sense? It's not like, oh, I hear the synthesizer in a high-end register. You know, it's something that's just adding this full you have to work with that. How high can I push it up to where it sounds like it's filling the frequency content, but all of a sudden it doesn't sound like, well, there's this lame synth that's just, you know, just some simple wavetable synth. It's just, you know, sinusoids or sawtooth wave, or, you know, I mean, even a square wave's pretty harsh, you know, a triangle wave, something like that, or some patch, or some, you know, I mean, how, you know, whatever you might use to color if you don't want it just clean, if the mix can handle it. So experiment with that. The more you experiment with that, that you will come to understanding what that's doing to it. That way that you start filling that in, and you've got it, you know, you've got that all filled out, and then you're going to try to put it behind this mix. Well, then you get them all, and you highlight all of them in your mix bar, and you start trying to push all of them up a little bit. And then all of a sudden you figure out, well, if you look at equal loudness contour, that, you know, your ear doesn't hear that bass as much as well, or that high end as well. So on those two that are filling the way high up or the way down low, you have to push those ones up a little bit more before it becomes noticeable, and you have to bring it back a little bit. Whereas down here in the 500 hertz area, that no, you can't, you actually have to subtract that a little bit. Does that make sense? Because of the way the ear hears sound, and at what levels they sound even. Because, does that make sense? So look at that equal loudness contour. And then you will understand when you start trying to bring that up behind some other mix to get that good full frequency content, that, you know, those concepts, it'll start to take shape the more you experiment with it, you know, and then you'll be going, wow, you know, all of a sudden I've got this full mix, dude. It was like, well, this song sounded a little bit cheesy, but now it's got body. It's like, well, you can tell something's back there in the high end, the lower end, and some in the mid ranges, and it's boosting that stuff up a little bit. You don't know exactly, you can't really hear it, put your finger on what it is, and it's not changing the sound of the genre, like making it some other genre or making it lose its vibe and its you know, feel. Does that make sense? And, you know, but it's adding this frequency content that's just giving it, you know, girth, impact, and body. So I hope I didn't ramble on about that too long. I hope that gave you some place to start, you know, so that you can understand filling in that frequency content and some of the concepts that will help you, and shaping that frequency content, those instruments into their own space, you know, to, you know, before you even start to fill in that other frequency content. And, you know, I certainly hope that you do a lot of experimenting so you can see it and hear it for yourself. Does that make sense? I hope that helped a lot. I address most of these issues in a lot of other videos on this channel, but that way, if you're looking on the channel and you're looking, I want to get a good full mix, that you've got something that says, want to get a good full mix on there that you can come look at. But I do suggest you go watch all those other videos so that you can get a really good understanding of all the concepts that are happening there. Alright, so the next video we're going to talk about spatialization. So that's another concept that's going to help you get a good full mix. Dynamics and spatialization and delays, detunings, and things like that to help you in the other area to get a good full mix. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next vid. Peace, hope, love.